It was 11 o'clock at night, and young Marriott was locked into his room, cramming as hard as he could cram. He'd been ploughed for this particular examination so often that his parents had positively declared they could no longer supply the funds to keep him there. So Marriott pulled himself together at last and made up his mind that he would pass or die in the attempt. And for some weeks now he'd been reading as hard as mortal man can read. His friends had promised not to disturb him. It was, therefore, with feelings a good deal stronger than mere surprise that he heard his doorbell ring on this particular night. Marriott jumped up from his books, unlocked the door, and passed into the little hallway with considerable wrath and annoyance. The stone staircase, dimly lighted at each floor by a gas jet that would not turn above a certain height, wound down to the level of the street with no pretence at carpet or railing. The acoustic properties of a spiral staircase seemed to be peculiar. Marriott, standing by the open door, thought every moment the owner of the footsteps would come into view. The sound of the boots was so close and so loud that they seemed to travel disproportionately in advance of their cause. But the man did not appear. A sudden queer sensation of fear passed over him, a faintness and a shiver down the back. He was just debating whether he would call aloud to his invisible visitor or slam the door and return to his books, when the cause of the disturbance turned the corner very slowly and came into view. He saw a youngish man. His face was the colour of a piece of chalk, and the eyes, which were very bright, had heavy lines underneath them. Though the cheeks and chin were unshaven and the general appearance unkempt, the man was evidently a gentleman. But he wore no hat, and although rain had been falling steadily all the evening, he appeared to have neither overcoat nor umbrella. Almost at once the caller turned his head a little so that the gaslight in the hall fell upon his features from a new angle. Then in a flash Marriott recognized him. "Field, man alive, is it you?" he gasped. They had been at a private school together years before, and though they had hardly met once since, the news had not failed to reach him from time to time with considerable detail. Young Field had gone wild. He remembered hearing about it all. Drink, a woman, he could not exactly call to mind. "Come in," he said at once, his anger vanishing. "Come in and tell me all about it, and perhaps I can help." He hardly knew what to say. He led the way across the hall. The other, though certainly sober, was unsteady on his legs, and evidently much exhausted. Marriott might not be able to pass his examinations, but he at least knew the symptoms of starvation. "Come along," he said. "I'm glad to see you. I was going to have a bite of something to eat, and you're just in time to join me." Marriott took his arm by way of support. He was as thin as a skeleton. As he touched him, the sensation of faintness and dread returned. It only lasted a moment, and he ascribed it not unnaturally to the distress and shock of seeing a former friend in such a pitiful plight. He led him to the sofa. "I'll get supper ready. Don't bother to talk, just take it easy. I see you're dead tired. You can tell me about it afterwards, and we'll make plans." The other sat down on the edge of the sofa and stared in silence. His eyes shone with a brightness that suggested drugs, Marriott thought, stealing a glance at him from behind the cupboard door. The fellow was in a bad way. So he let his visitor rest while he busied himself with the supper. "Now, let's tuck in," he said, "and afterwards we'll have a pipe and a chat." He looked up and caught his guest's eyes directed straight upon his own. An involuntary shudder ran through him from head to foot. The face opposite him was deadly white, and wore a dreadful expression of pain and mental suffering. "By gad," he said, jumping up, "I quite forgot. I've got some whiskey somewhere. What an ass I am." He went to the cupboard and poured out a stiff glass, which the other swallowed at a single gulp. Marriott watched him while he drank it, and at the same time noticed something else as well. Field's coat was all over dust, and on one shoulder was a bit of cobweb. It was perfectly dry. Field arrived on a soaking wet night without hat, umbrella, or overcoat, and yet perfectly dry, even dusty. It was very strange. They ate their supper together while the host carried on a running one-sided conversation, chiefly about himself and his exams. But while he toyed with his food, Field ate like an animal, gobbled, stuffed, gorged. Marriott forgot his reading and began to feel something very much like a lump in his throat. "I shall be up all night reading for this blessed exam. You're more than welcome to my bed. Tomorrow we'll have a late breakfast and see what can be done." Field appeared to acquiesce, and the other led the way into the bedroom. The weary guest staggered across the room and dropped his exhausted body on the bed. In less than a minute he was to all appearances sound asleep. Marriott watched him, wondering what he would do with his unbidden guest. But the call of his books was imperative. He sat down and resumed his notes. But his thoughts kept wandering. He recalled their school days together before they had drifted apart, and how they had vowed eternal friendship, and all the rest of it. And now, through the half-open door, the bedroom led out of the sitting room and had no other door, came the sound of deep, long-drawn breathing, the regular, steady breathing of a tired man, so tired that even to listen to it made Marriott almost want to go to sleep himself. He needed it, reflected the student, and perhaps it came only just in time. There was nothing to disturb the worker but an occasional rush of wind against the windows and a pain in his arm. This bothered him, and he tried to remember how and when he could have bruised himself so severely, but without success. At length the page before him turned from yellow to grey. It was 4 o'clock. Marriott leaned back and yawned prodigiously. Field was still breathing heavily in the next room, and he first tiptoed across the floor to take another look at him. Peering cautiously round the half-open door, his first glance fell upon the bed, now plainly discernible in the grey light of morning. He stared hard. Then he rubbed his eyes. He stared harder still and harder. But it made no difference at all. He was staring into an empty room. The sensation of fear he had felt when Field first appeared upon the scene returned suddenly, but with much greater force. He became conscious, too, that his left arm was throbbing violently and causing him great pain. He was trembling from head to foot. By a great effort of the will, he left the support of the door and walked forward boldly into the room. There, upon the bed, was the impress of a body. There was the mark of the head on the pillow, and the slight indentation at the foot of the bed where the boots had rested on the counterpane. And there, plainer than ever, for he was closer to it, was the breathing. With a great effort he found his voice and called his friend aloud by name. "Field, is that you? Where are you?" There was no reply. The breathing continued without interruption, coming directly from the bed, but there was no sign of anyone. Curious thoughts began to trouble Marriott's mind. A cold perspiration broke out all over his body, and the sound of heavy breathing all this time never ceased to come from the corner where Field had lain down to sleep. He went back into his sitting room, opened the windows, and tried to think the whole matter over quietly and clearly. The thing was incredible. It was absurd. Haunted by visions of brain fever and insanity, Marriott put on his cap and mackintosh and left the house. The morning air would blow the cobwebs from his brain. He did not return until the exercise had shaken some of the horror out of his bones. As he entered, he saw that there was another man in the room, standing against the windows with his back to the light. He recognized his fellow student Green, who was reading for the same examination. "Thought I'd drop in here to compare notes and have some breakfast. Didn't know you had any friends who drank, Marriott." Marriott replied dryly that he did not know it either. "Sounds as if some chap were sleeping it off in there, doesn't it, though?" persisted the other, with a nod in the direction of the bedroom. "Then you can hear it too, thank God," Marriott said earnestly. "Of course I can hear it." "I'm awfully relieved," said Marriott. And thereupon he related exactly what had happened during the night, even down to the pain in his arm. "You hear the breathing now plainly, don't you?" he said. Green said he did. Well, come with me, and we'll search the room together." The other, however, did not move from his chair.
"I've been in already," he said sheepishly. "I heard the sounds and thought it was you. The door was ajar, so I went in."
Green questioned his friend very closely, but without illuminating result, since questions cannot alter facts. "The only thing that ought to have a proper logical explanation is the pain in my arm," said Marriott. "It hurts so infernally and aches all the way up. I can't remember bruising it there." Marriott rolled up his sleeve. "By George, I'm bleeding," he exclaimed. On the forearm, quite close to the wrist, was a thin red line. There was a tiny drop of apparently fresh blood on it. Marriott sat very still, staring silently at his arm.
"What's the matter? I see nothing very strange about a scratch," said Green.
But Marriott leaned forward close to his friend's face. "Look," he said in a low voice. "Do you see that red mark? I mean, underneath what you call the scratch."
"Yes, I see," returned the other. "It looks like an old scar."
"It is an old scar," whispered Marriott, his lips trembling. "The field made that scar."
"You mean last night?"
"No, years ago. At school, with his knife. And I made a scar in his arm with mine. We exchanged drops of blood in each other's cuts."
"In the name of heaven, what for?"
"It was a boys' compact. We'd been reading some dreadful book, and we swore to appear to one another. I mean, whoever died first swore to show himself to the other. And we sealed the compact with each other's blood. And I've never thought of it again to this day."
"And you mean?"
stammered Green. But Marriott made no answer. He got up and crossed the room, and lay down wearily upon the sofa, hiding his face in his hands. Green walked over to the bedroom, opened the door, and listened. The sound of deep, regular breathing came floating through the air. Green closed the door and came back.
"There's only one thing to do," he declared. "Write home and find out about him. And meanwhile, come and finish your reading in my rooms. I've got an extra bed."
"Agreed," returned the other. And this was what they did. It was about a week later when Marriott got an answer from his sister. Part of it he read to Green. "It is curious that you should have inquired after Field. Sir John's patience became exhausted, and he turned him out of the house. Well, what do you think? It looks like suicide. Instead of leaving the house, he went down into the cellar and simply starved himself to death. They're trying to suppress it, of course, but I heard it all from the maid. They found his body on the 14th, and the doctor said he had died about 12 hours before. He was dreadfully thin. And he died on the 13th, said Green. Marriott nodded. That's the very night he came to see you. Marriott nodded again.
Matthew Marsh was reading Keeping His Promise by Algernon Blackwood. It was abridged by Robin Brooks, and the producer was Clive Brill. Algernon Blackwood's Ghost Stories is a Pacificus production.